Today we're going to be talking about absolute versus justified certitude, explaining human certainty as an evidence-based spectrum. Our agenda is to talk about Descartes and his view of absolute certainty, and then some critiques of Descartes, such as Peirce and common sensism, Wittgenstein and language problems, Gallagher and justified certitude, and then conclude with final thoughts. First, Descartes, 17th century French philosopher, scientist and mathematician, and a primary figure in modern philosophy in the Enlightenment. In his Meditations on First Philosophy, he works on his project with a paradigm that certainty only comes when any and all cause for doubt is eliminated. And his project is to prove the existence of the self, the external world, and God, and eliminate all reason for doubt for these things. For Descartes, if there's room for doubt, there's no certainty. In his own words, reason already persuades me that I ought to withhold my assent from matters which are not entirely certain and indubitable. If I am able to find in each one some reason to doubt, this will suffice to justify my rejecting the whole. So here he has a very black and white dichotomy of giving or withholding assent. A matter is either indubitable or dubitable, and any reason whatsoever to doubt something justifies our complete rejection of that idea. Some critiques of this view start coming into the forefront, especially in the 20th century. We have Charles Peirce, an American philosopher, also scientist and mathematician, known as the father of pragmatism, has a few things to say here. He applies common sensism to the problem and proposes that a thing itself can't be indubitable inherently. Doubt is something that's relative to the person who's doing the believing or the doubting. So possible doubt does not discount belief. Peirce says, let us not pretend to doubt in philosophy what we do not doubt in our hearts. And here we see his pragmatism or common sensism coming through. Just because we can imagine being wrong does not mean that we are justified in doubting. Indubitability for Peirce is not an inherent characteristic of the belief or believer in isolation. Common sense beliefs are indubitable only relative to a certain depth of knowledge and range of experience. In other words, a thing can't be undoubtable or doubtable in and of itself, nor is a person inherently able or unable to believe. A person's depth of knowledge and experience changes over time, so the question of certainty and doubt is going to be flexible. I also want to note that there's a difference between something being indubitable and being in a psychological state of doubt. There might be something that is proven in the best way possible with no room for doubt whatsoever in an objective sense, but yet you could imagine someone still having doubts about it and being in a psychological state of doubt. I think this is a clarification that Descartes might have missed. Next, we have Ludwig Wittgenstein, an Austrian philosopher of logic, math, and language, one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, coming from Bertrand Russell's analytic philosophy tradition. Wittgenstein examines the grammar of certainty, that is, what do we mean by that word? And he also, along with Peirce, is going to say that the possibility of doubt does not mean that certainty is impossible. Just because we can imagine that doubt exists doesn't mean that we can't be certain. So what do we even mean by the word certain? Wittgenstein urges that in philosophy we should look at a word's ordinary usage rather than some transcendent meaning that exists outside of our grammatical use of that word. Wittgenstein will also say that we need to be careful not to confuse how knowledge itself actually works with our grammatical or ordinary use of words like certainty versus doubt. So we have a quote from scholar Ronald Hall stating that Wittgenstein attempted to show that philosophy's failed epistemological search for the existence of factual certainties rests on a grammatical mistake about what certainty is, a mistake about the meaning of certainty. So the concepts of certainty and doubt don't exist in a vacuum, so we can't treat them like independent topics. We will get an example of this in a minute. In paying attention to use, it is hard to deny that in common usage, certainty and doubt are locked in a perpetual struggle where both cannot win. So usually, customarily, we think of certainty and doubt being these two things pitted against each other that are, so to speak, fighting a battle. And that's sort of our imagination about those words, partly based on our language. But just because we imagine the two words that way doesn't mean that certainty and doubt are such a black and white, harsh dichotomy like Descartes thought. Wittgenstein also says that we should not suppose that we are in doubt because it is possible for us to imagine doubt. So just because you can imagine being wrong doesn't mean you are justified in doubting something. Next, we have Kenneth Gallagher moving forward in time. We're going to be drawing from his work, The Philosophy of Knowledge, in 1964. He is an American and Catholic scholar. So for Gallagher, humans have cognitive responses to what we experience. Certitude is just one possible response. He will also emphasize that humans are ever changing, so what we know and how we know also changes. Finally, he presents a view of justified certitude and doubt. We can have justified reasons to believe or reject something, which ultimately leads to a conclusion that certainty can be on a spectrum. There could be degrees of certainty and not just an all or nothing situation. Here is a passage straight from Gallagher. If evidence is the way being is present to me, it clearly may vary greatly, and the sort of assent warranted by this varying presence will also vary greatly. Shall we reserve the name certitude for those assents which are absolutely warranted, and regard every other assent as simply highly probable? This, in effect, is what Descartes proposed doing. Either the feeling is something that is absolutely certain, or it is not certain at all. This view has obvious merits, and yet there is a lot to be said for the familiar view, which classifies certitude into various types. Considered as warranted assents, there seem to be various positions of the mind which are not unconditional, and yet which are not satisfactorily lumped together as mere high degrees of probability. In other words, certitude isn't necessarily all or nothing. Neither is knowledge a matter of mere probability. We can look to the evidence available to us, i.e., how being is present to me. And these types of knowledge based on different types of evidence is how we can come to this conclusion that certainty can be a matter of degrees rather than something that we have or don't have absolutely. So there are different types of certitude for Gallagher, and he prefaces this by saying that there are first principles that we might perhaps say are absolutes that we cannot doubt. They are that from which something else flows or derives. They are the sources from which the possibility of every specific thought arises. Aquinas referred to these as being essentially innate. They are the principle of identity, the principle of sufficient reason, and the principle of efficient causality. The principle of identity is simply that a thing is what it is and can't be what it's not. Principle of sufficient reason is that everything that exists has a reason for existing. And the principle of efficient causality is that everything that exists was caused to exist. These sound pretty obvious, but that is really the point, and it's important to note that these are things that we can be sure of simply because they are necessary in order for us to proceed with any meaningful statement or conversation. But beyond these first principles, we have these other evidences, and Gallagher admits that these are imperfect evidences, but this is what we have to work with in our human experience that give us our degrees of certitude. We have physical certitude, which is based on the evidence of the observable world or the laws of nature, so that we can be certain to the degree that physical certitude gives us warrant, that the sun will rise tomorrow. We also have moral certitude, and there are various types of moral certitude. These are based on our intuitive senses or the likelihood of something. So an example might be trusting other people. I trust that when I'm crossing the crosswalk, the person stopped at the light isn't going to just intentionally run me over. Now, obviously, I know that that could happen, but intuitively, on a day-to-day basis, I'm pretty certain that's not going to happen. We also believe the testimony of others about events and facts, even though we don't have firsthand experience. We believe that Julius Caesar existed or that Paris exists, even though we didn't live in Julius Caesar's day and we haven't actually been to Paris, for example. And the cumulative strength of testimony and these examples can increase the warrant that we have to believe something. So the more pieces of evidence of this type that we have, the stronger our justification for believing something can be. So we can see here that knowledge doesn't have to be a matter of complete certainty or complete rejection. We can say, if we wanted to be mathematical, I'm 80% certain about X, Y, and Z. And though there's not really a way to quantify things so precisely, in theory, that's kind of the idea. I have this amount of evidence, so I'm generally this sure about something. And this is actually a valid way to navigate knowledge. But Gallagher says it is an unmistakable, if lamentable fact that man for the most part is deprived of anything that can be dignified by the name certitude at all. We aren't absolutely certain of very many things, as it turns out. However, this doesn't mean that we have no true knowledge or a 0% certainty. Just because we can't be absolutely certain of very many things doesn't mean that knowledge is a mirage. Turns out we don't need absolute certainty. Gallagher ends this section of his work by saying, most of our lives are spent in acting, and acting does not require, and most often does not allow, hidebound certitude. What we most frequently act upon is opinion, a cognitive response to evidence not grasped as coercive, but seen as sufficient to warrant action. In other words, we don't need certainty in order to live our lives effectively. We operate by opinion, which draws from evidence such as the aforementioned. Finally, I want to end with a quick note from St. Aquinas. He says, the thing known is in the knower according to the mode of the knower. Hence, the knowledge of every knower is ruled according to its own nature. And I wanted to include this because it ties into a lot of what our other philosophers have been saying, that knowledge isn't about the indubitability or conceivability of the object itself, but rather the nature of the knower. Descartes asks, what objects of knowledge are secure and not illusory, when perhaps he should have emphasized questions like, what are humans capable of knowing? How much can we know? And what do we even need to know? In conclusion, Descartes' paradigm of absolute certainty versus doubt does not actually align with human experience or human nature very well. Certainty and doubt are relative to the knower and to the evidence that the knower has. We should be cautious. Certainty and doubt can refer to a range of concepts. We need to be careful about what the words we use even mean when we're talking about epistemological questions like this. Gallagher helps us identify what valid pieces of evidence we can use for having justified certitude. This brings us closer to understanding the nature of knowledge if we can actually pick out and identify what counts as valid evidence. Another caution is how important is absolute certainty? Perhaps this is not something that we actually even need in order to live our lives effectively, as Descartes supposed. Thank you.